Joan's article happened to come into our mailbox because my mother was Columbia University alumna, and I was very intrigued by what I read and shared it with my teacher, mentor, the late Ellie Siegmeister, who then elaborated on what he knew, which was a great deal about Marc Blitzstein. Ellie was one of the greatest teachers that I ever had, and I'd just like you to hear something that was said about Marc Blitzstein as a teacher, which when I read it again, after having read it for the first time 30 years ago, moved me to tears. "You are the finest teacher who has ever taught me, and the greatest man I've ever known. Somehow, because I knew you, I had something to live for, because your courage and integrity, which was in everything you did and said, taught me that there are good people left and things to live and fight for." Lee Wolcott. Does anybody know where she is?
She was a student of his at Betty.
That's right.
She's what?
We don't know where she is. She gave a concert in his memory in '64, and this is quoted in Eric Gordon's biography.
What was
And
her name again?
her name is Reed Wolcott. But this is how I felt about some of the teachers that I had, and one of them is here today, that's Robert Palmer, who knew Blitzstein and whom I was sent by Siegmeister, and who helped me when I was a graduate student at Cornell, wrestling with identity problems that, in a musical way, that Joan identified as being Marc's problems, between the vernacular and the sophisticated, the 12-tone and the tonal, and so forth and so on. You went through the whole list. And so when Columbia exploded in 1968, I knew the Cradle Will Rock, having looked at it from Siegmeister's own score, and I said, we have to do this. And it took me a year to put together a production. And I did everything. I adapted it, and I adapted it, and I staged it, and cast it, and was even going to play the clerk the way Lenny did 30 years earlier, but I didn't have to do that. Although we took it to a student strike performance at Tufts, and several of the actors chose not to endanger themselves, and I ended up playing several roles, including Mr. Mystic. But Ellie sent me a note that said, "The soul of Marc hovers over Cambridge tonight." And Leonard Bernstein found out about the production, and he said, "Well, I'm glad somebody at Harvard still has taste." That was his reaction. So after I did that, I became interested in looking at the unfinished works of Blitzstein, which I had read about in Joan Pfeiffer's article, and which Siegmeister also had looked at for an article he was writing about Blitzstein. So I went down and looked at them, and discovered a passage in Idiots First that was practically, it was different from anything else I'd seen in Marc, but it was practically identical in harmonic structure to something I had just written in. It became my Harvard thesis. So I discovered this affinity on so many levels. And when I couldn't study with Scherzer, he was dead, but I studied with Boulanger. And while I was at Cornell studying with Robert Palmer, I also managed to get the experience in working on pieces by collaborators of Blitzstein. Just as Blitzstein translated Three Penny Opera, I translated two Brecht plays, Days of Commune and Roundheads and Pointed Heads, and produced them at Harvard and Cornell. Just as Blitzstein had written Juno in collaboration with Sean O'Casey, who wrote some of the lyrics for that. I staged Bedtime Story with Christopher Reeve, playing a wimp for the first time in his life. Later we said, I thought it was played by him. And just as Blitzstein had been collaborating with Malamud, who Ned Rorem said would have been his ideal collaborator, I collaborated with Malamud. I staged Malamud's only published play, Suppose a Wedding, which later became an opera that we did at Hebrew College and several places. So I really tried to do everything that Marc Blitzstein did or would have done. And I completed Idiots First, having analyzed it with Siegmeister, with Boulanger, with Robert Palmer. And then I had to play it for Leonard Bernstein. Well, that's a story in itself, how I finally got to play it for Leonard Bernstein. We can skip over that. After Idiots First, which was part of a series of operas called Tales of Malamud, I wrote one or two others to go with that. It had 3 productions, and it won several awards in 1978 while I was conducting it and working at the Metropolitan Opera's assistant chorus master. And that at that point, after that success, I approached Jimmy Levine about the idea of doing SACCO and Vanzetti, completing SACCO and Vanzetti. And he was intrigued. He sent me to John Dexter, who unfortunately never opened the door to me. I kept trying to get an appointment, and every day I was told not today for 6 months. So that didn't happen at that time. But I've seen Jimmy Levine in the last few months, and he says he's still interested, and he wanted to look at the score this summer while he's on vacation. So Theodore Presser sent it to him. Now, in between 1978 and 2001, a lot did happen with this work. I persuaded Josephine Davis, Marc Blitzstein's sister, to give me permission to complete it, but she died in 1986. And her two sons were less certain about that. One of them is Christopher Davis, a writer who was here last night, along with his brother Stephen Davis. And Christopher Davis told me, actually he told me of Leonard Boudin's funeral, where we were in a receiving line together, trapped for about a half an hour. He told me, he said, I'm a writer. I wouldn't want anybody messing with my work after I die. I want my uncle's work just left in peace. And I said, but I finished it, he was first. He said, well, my mother wanted me to do that, but I don't know that I would have wanted to do it had she not wanted it. She was dead. So, what changed his mind? Well, he was very excited last night, so something did change his mind. It took a long time, though. We had a symposium that was sponsored by the National Opera Association, and it took place in Boston, the book was placed, and it was published in the Opera Journal in March '96. You can read it on the internet. It's both on my website and on the Marc Blitzstein website. All about SACCO and Vanzetti, how much was sketched but how little was finished. People said it was about half finished. It wasn't anywhere near half finished, but there was some of the scenes were sketched 16 times. You could start a song that many times and break it off. So there was an awful lot to be done, but there were thousands of pages of not just sketches but notations in other people's books about SACCO and Vanzetti. I'm eager to hear about Maestro Coppola's research in SACCO and Vanzetti. Blitzstein met with Gardner Jackson, with Tom O'Connor, with Herbert Ehrman, and in the back of Herbert Ehrman's book, The Untried Case, he wrote in his own felt tip pen, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 in the appendix. So that was the only way that I could tell exactly what he actually had in mind that would, for the series of events in the opera. In 1990, we recorded a Blitzstein cabaret, which included that song "Stood Sent for the Militia" in its first recording, and an aria from SACCO and Vanzetti, the only aria that he had considered actually complete. We recorded that, and then of course came Tim Robbins' Cradle Rock film, and I had originally proposed doing a Marc Blitzstein songbook to go with the CD. But somebody else was asked to do it, and then he didn't do anything on it, so the Blitzstein estate got impatient with him and came back to me because they wanted it out in time for the Tim Robbins film. And when I finished this, I showed them some of the sketches that I was doing in SACCO and Vanzetti. He said, well, we'd be willing to look at anything. No commitment, but we'd be willing to look at anything. So, in the summer of 1999, I had a semi-centennial concert for works of my own, my students, and my teachers. And Robert Palmer came all the way from Ithaca for that. And it was at that time, because I did a piece of his, and it was at that time that I learned that, I knew he knew Blitzstein, but what I didn't know was that he had been in Rome on a Fulbright in '61 when Blitzstein was writing this piece, and then Blitzstein invited him up to his apartment, and they had played it together. So he had tremendous insight. So I finished the first act in time for his visit, played it for him. He wrote a letter to the Blitzstein estate. Then they approved my doing it. That's why I dedicated the opera to Robert Palmer. And I would